Hey, what's good, everybody? It is time for the most recent statistics. What's going on in the real estate market and everything going on with real estate, specifically to the South Surrey and White Rock neighborhoods. And this is for what has just finished in the month of January 2026. And we're filming this in February of 2026. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So, the home price index, for those that are following along and new to this video, we are tracking what is happening with a typical home in the area. So whether it's a condominium, a townhouse, or a detached home, the typical home is not a real house. It's not an average house. It is more like thinking like what is happening with inflation. Is prices going up or down with houses? And this is all done from a really great algorithm that is used across the country, actually created by UBC for the purposes of just really helping track what happens with housing in terms of prices. It's used by the media, it's used by the government. It's our really best tool to kind of see what's going on. So it's the typical home. It's taking a look at the typical home in a neighborhood, how it's performing, and watches the value, whether that goes up or down over time without skewing the data. So at a very high level, before we get into kind of the niche stuff, I wanted to show you this because I think this is really useful. This is the most recent statistics package released by the Fraser Valley Real Estate Board. And what they're showing here is that home prices in the Fraser Valley fell for the 10th consecutive month in January, pushing the benchmark price below the $900,000 mark for the first time since the spring of 2021. They go on to say that for a typical home in the Fraser Valley, the benchmark price dropped and was down about 6.9% year over year. That wasn't enough to get people off the sidelines. There was only 619 sales recorded across the entire real estate association. So for the Fraser Valley Board, that is North Delta all the way to Abbotsford, which doesn't seem like a lot. Now, we do have to recognize that it was January as well. January typically is a slower month for sales. But that said, that was a 33% decrease from December and a 24% decrease from the same month of last year. Now, of course, same month last year, we didn't have quite as crazy of a world as we did. We might have thought it was coming, but we didn't have it at the time. So it certainly, makes sense when you compare to the back half of 2025. New listings increased 128% in January to 3,078, reflecting typical seasonal patterns. However, activity remained 10% below last year's level. So let's get into some of these numbers here a little bit. What you're seeing on the screen here is just all properties thrown into a blender. The red line is for the Greater Vancouver Real Estate Board, which is like Whistler all the way down to Tri-Cities, Richmond, Maple Ridge is in there, that sort of stuff. And then the blue line is the Fraser Valley Board, as I mentioned earlier. So getting into South Surrey and White Rock, the sales to active ratio finished just above the 10% mark. And that is really great for buyers, not so great for home sellers. You can see the red bar there. That represents what is called a balanced market condition. And you can see we're quite a bit below there. And in fact, when you get from like 15% where you're kind of in that balanced market condition down to 10%, that doesn't sound like a big drop, but the lower you go, the more impactful that means. So as an example, when you see 1 or 12% of homes selling, if you're kind of doing the math on that at home, that's like 1 out of 8 properties selling. But if you have 10% rather than 12%, that's 1 out of 10. That's a big difference. So it was a pretty challenging market for condominiums in January in the area of South Surrey, White Rock, and that was reflected in the price as well. You can see what's happened really since 2023. And in fact, any price changes since 2023 have effectively been erased. And I'm going to pick up on that a little bit later here. Now, in month over month, condominiums in the neighborhood came down about $5,300, and year over year, they're down about 32,700, which is a fairly big number. So naturally, as you would imagine, the advantage is for buyers in a market like this. In fact, activity just generally going on in the market is at about an 18-month low, which is pretty crazy. One thing that strikes me as interesting in driving around South Surrey, and if you're not following us on our Instagram channel, the German group, you're definitely want to check that out because we publish a lot about what's going on in town just in short form. So we keep this YouTube channel more towards the long form content about what's going on in the community, but there's a lot of neighborhood tidbits that go out on there. And I'm struck by the amount of new construction you see in and around South Surrey. There's tons of condominium projects either underway and big communities, or there's lots on the way that you're maybe not so sure about. So I find that quite interesting because that's all going to be competitive on the market in a not too far distant future. I'm going to touch on interest rates a little bit as well because anybody watching this video, it's not a fair thing to say that the real estate market is not good. And the reason it's not fair to say that is because if it's not good for a seller, that automatically means that it would be good for a buyer. If it's not good for a buyer, that means it's automatically good for a seller. You can't have two competing interests have the same story be true. And I want to touch on mortgage rates towards the end of this video. So make sure you hang around because there's some important things that you're going to want to know, especially if you're someone that's been sitting on the sidelines and just watching what's happening with rates. I'm going to show you some really interesting stuff. So, without giving away too much, they're likely not going to change at all in 2026, but I'll touch on that. Sellers, if you're looking at selling your condominium right now, you need to be ultra competitive. You need to be the prettiest one in town and you need to be priced well. Otherwise, you are going to sit on the market. And when the market's looking like that and dropping like that, you want to be paying attention because every month that goes by could be costing you money and you don't want to slowly drift away from the shore of whatever your price may be because you're not paying attention. You're not actually reacting to the market. Let's talk about townhomes now. Townhomes, excuse me, still a very similar graph to what we saw in condominiums. In fact, they're sitting just above the 10% mark as well. And that has had an impact in pricing, as you would expect. So townhomes are down a whopping 24,700 in 1 month. Now, we did have some gains the previous month in the townhome sector, month over month. So we've given some of those back. And actually, you can kind of see that in this graph right here where we popped up in price. And then we gave some of it back in a little bit more, unfortunately, for any townhome owners in the area. Year over year, down about 75,500. So again, naturally, as you would assume, this is the market that's quite an advantage of the buyers. If you're looking at buying something, you got a lot to look at, and days on market has gone up. So it's been fairly good in that regard just to be a buyer and to be able to go out shopping. We saw a big swing in month over month prices. As I was saying, like that's a pretty big difference. So, who knows, maybe even the month before was a little bit of a blip in the market, but almost a $25,000 swing is pretty incredible. This is going to continue to be the market of movement, the one to watch. All those missing middle homes that people of my age, I'm an elder millennial, but any of those millennials that are having families and whatnot, townhomes are the perfect buy simply because they're typically within their affordability range, and they've also got the space that they need for their young families. So I've said this before, but you're going to want to continue to watch the townhome market there because it will continue to prove, in my estimation, to be the best market of all for how it performs. And again, selling is going to be very competitive. So make sure you're priced right. You don't want to find yourself sliding in price like that every single month. So I know lots of people that didn't pay attention that wanted to sell their townhomes in the area of South Surrey, and they had to succumb to the market conditions simply because they didn't act. So just be careful out there. Let's talk about detached now. What's going on in the area? So you can see how big and thick that red line is right there. And that is because the detached home market is actually the most challenged out of all the categories. You can see it's floating in and around the 7% sales to active ratio. I want you to think about 7%. That's almost one out of, are you ready for it? 1 out of 14 homes that are going to the market for detached homes in South Surrey and White Rock are actually transacting. And that's had an impact on prices as you would expect, but not as aggressive. Interestingly enough, not as aggressive as townhomes and condominiums. The drop hasn't been so big. Now, it was a big drop throughout 2025, but you can see we've kind of flatlined a little bit. Month over month, they're down about $4,300, which in percentage points for detached homes really isn't that much money. Year over year, they're down about 115,000 in terms of the typical home in the neighborhood. Now, again, as you would assume, this is an advantage for the buyers in this neighborhood. There is a ton of inventory to choose from. Go shoot your shot, write your offers because their sellers are struggling out there in South Surrey, White Rock. There's so much competition. That's almost that's like 5%. It's like 1 out of 20 homes that's selling. That's really challenging to be a seller in. So if you are someone that's selling your detached home in South Surrey and White Rock, hope is not a strategy. It's simply not. Wishing it to be better doesn't mean it's going to get better. So you need to price it properly if you're actually serious about getting it sold. Prices are going to continue to remain challenged in this area because it's pretty hard to get out of a market like that that's been so far below the balanced market conditions for so long. It's tough for to get out of that. So naturally, there's advantage for buyers. Now, I promised that I would talk a little bit about mortgage rates in this video. This certainly isn't a prediction, but I'm going to let you know what some other people have said regarding where they think mortgage rates are going to go. Because the Bank of Canada has kind of signaled that they don't really expect that they're going to be doing any rate cuts this year. And in fact, I thought I would share this with you. This is from the British Columbia Real Estate Association, and a couple of highlights of their mortgage forecast report, which you can find on their website. Just talked about how the Canadian fixed mortgage rates are holding steady amongst bond volatility. If you're not familiar with how fixed mortgage rates work versus variable mortgage rates, there's lots of videos on our YouTube channel about that. Trade uncertainty, we won't get into that. And then after 2 rounds of rate cuts, is the Bank of Canada done? And what they're kind of predicting for where variable rates will be throughout this year, you can see flat. They don't expect any changes from the Bank of Canada. They do figure that the 5-year discounted rate will also remain flat. They don't expect it to change. So if you're somebody out there that's been waiting for some really great news or some really exciting news in regards to mortgages and whatnot, you might be waiting a while. So something to consider. So what's driving the market? What are some things you need to watch out for, whether you're considering buying or selling? Well, there was another report that I talked about last month where CIBC Economics predicts the Bank of Canada policy rate will remain at the 2.25% until the end of this year. So again, a little more information, I guess, from an economist. It's a prediction at the end of the day, but that's what they're thinking is going to happen as well. There's a lot of stuff in the news right now that we need to pay attention to as Canadians. One is the Supreme Court ruling with the United States on what's going to be happening with the tariffs, and we could be getting that in February. We're potentially going to get it in January. We didn't, but that's a pretty big announcement in terms of how people are going to feel about our economy and whatnot, for the better or for worse. So something you probably want to pay attention to. Of course, maybe there's some trade deals that are coming. There's a lot of talk about CUSMA being renegotiated and stuff like that. I'm not the economics guy. I'm just reporting on some of the stuff going on, but certainly some stuff to pay attention to if you're worried about the bigger picture and what's going on. We know demand is certainly there. It has been there for a long, long time. And these people who need to buy homes are sitting on the sidelines just watching. And there will be a day where they're complaining about house prices again. And they still maybe are, but house prices have definitely come down a ton. In fact, what's really interesting is we are pretty much, for most product types across the board, at the same price points we were in late 2021. So think 5 years ago almost now. Prices are almost back to where they were at that time. So it's pretty interesting to think about. And that could be the end of the price drops, or we could be giving back more of all that hard-earned equity that, well, I don't know. Should we call it hard-earned equity? I don't know if people had hard-earned equity these times. I mean, that's not the right way to say it, but are we done giving back some of those gains that we saw throughout 2021? Kind of that COVID market sort of thing. Seasonal trends, it's coming out of January. It's one of the slower markets typically, or the slower times of year for real estate. So spring market's typically the busiest. So we actually put a really cool video on the YouTube channel about waiting for spring as a buyer and waiting for spring as a seller. And you should definitely check that out, because I bet you there's misconceptions you have about the spring market that it's really going to surprise you. So you're going to want to watch that. And local policy changes, we haven't heard any crazy ideas from the BC government yet. So we'll leave that as it is for now. And let's just cross our fingers that we have a little bit of a steady real estate market in that regard throughout 2026. So anyways, guys, if you have any questions about what is going on in the local market, you're always welcome to reach out. There is a link in the description to book a time to speak with me if you'd like to connect, or you can DM me or email me, whatever that might be. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel. We got some banger videos coming out all about South Surrey, White Rock, and Surrey and British Columbia real estate that you do not want to miss. I got some really good ones that are ready to be released. So anyways, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next month. Cheers.